those green areas there are the areas that will be impacted at this time by the regulations. As you can see in the lower left corner, you can see the town of Westport, which is like a lime green, and you can see the town of Dartmouth right alongside it, and you really can't see the municipal boundary with New Bedford, which is the darker green. Next. Those areas that are shaded in green were studied by the Mass Department of Environmental Protection through what was called the Massachusetts Estuaries Project. The Massachusetts Estuaries Project studied both the Slocum River watershed as well as the Westport River watershed. Those studies began in the early 2000s. Exactly, they started collecting data, I believe, between 2001 in the Slocum River and 2006, and somewhere around 2003 to 2009, plus or minus. Following that, they compiled the report, which you'll be able to find on our website, and we'll post each of those tomorrow to our website if they're not already there. And it determined that those watersheds have what is called a TMDL, a total maximum daily load for nutrients, be it nitrogen. The Slocum River watershed is described as largely impaired, as well as portions of the Westport River, and unfortunately, I'm not as familiar with that document because of everything that we do in the Board of Health and the newness of these regulations and the need to dive into these regulations on a technical side before we even start looking at the science side of these regulations. I believe it was on September 30th of 2018, the Mass Department of Environmental Protection held a public hearing at the town of Dartmouth Town Hall on Slocum Road. I believe that public hearing is still available to you all to watch on DCTV by upload. We can see that we can try to get that uploaded probably the following week if you care to watch it. At that public hearing, there was a presentation by Mass DEP about the estuaries report for the Slocum River and their findings, which determined it to be impaired. There were comments made, both oral, for, and concerns about some of the situations that may have been overlooked given the amount of time between 2018 and when the study was largely in the field. It's my understanding that the Slocum River watershed has been submitted to Mass DEP and is an approved TMDL. I have to say that because I don't have the actual approval document, so I have to speak with some uncertainty. There is also the Westport River. And why are we worried about the Westport River? Well, these are vast watersheds. These watersheds, are big drainage basins. The Slocum River watershed, I know it's hard for you to see, but it actually extends all the way up to the airport in New Bedford. If any of you have any questions about is my property in this watershed or that watershed, we're happy to answer that. You can just let us know the road, and I can probably have a pretty good idea. The Westport River watershed, interestingly enough, also extends into Dartmouth. So if you could advance the next slide. So in that Slocum River watershed, I'm not sure if it's going to show up all that well. It does. So you can see the town of Dartmouth here, the blue line, and here's the red line that kind of runs up through most of the town. There are significant areas within that that are served by septic systems. There are some areas within that that are served by sewer, but not a whole lot. The area along Smith Neck Road is not within that watershed. Bliss Corner is not within that watershed. Next slide, please. This is another attempt. Unfortunately, at this point in time, we don't have good maps to pull from the state. The state, with these regulations, has promised that they'll put forth maps, and hopefully they're more readable than these from the report. But you can see this blue area that is shown on this map here. That is that portion of the Westport River watershed that resides here in Dartmouth. And that area is largely described as the area that's east of Highland Ave, mostly north of Route 6, and then to the west of Fawns Corner Road, extending all the way up to the Freetown line. Next, please. So part of the estuary report that has been approved provided us with controllable sources of nitrogen. So the purpose of this estuaries report was to find out what is holding back the ecological restoration of the Slocum River, or any other river that was studied under the estuaries program. Clean water under the Clean Water Act is not enough if it's clear like this, that they also want ecological restoration. So ecological restoration is going to be the restoration of plant life and animal life that would be expected, and the absence of that is or may be an indicator of impairment. And these comprehensive estuary reports that were conducted that began almost 20 years ago, and in some cases over 20 years ago, identified at that time what they perceived, calculated as the controllable sources of nitrogen. Nitrogen is that factor that when it is in the ecosystem or the marine environment, what can hold back the restoration or degrade the environment. It can cause eelgrass to subside, and then all those other organisms that may depend upon that environment. So in that, you can see here that wastewater is 29% of that. We do not have any discharges from our wastewater treatment plant in that watershed. So that 29% is from septic systems. You also see 6% of landfill. Golf courses around 15%. I'm reading at an angle, so if I get it wrong, just holler out at me. Agricultural fertilizer, 8%. Farm animals, 13%. And impervious surfaces, 29%. So in a little bit, we'll be getting into those regulations. But I think this is an important chart for you all to remember, because there is no 50% or 75% majority of single source of controllable nitrogen within the Slocum River watershed. It's only a little bit less than a third. Next. This is taken from the Westport River report. Theirs is a little bit different. They show agriculture as being 57% of the controllable nitrogen. So you just got to pardon that it says N in there, and the N stands for nitrogen. Septic systems at 34%, landfill 1%, lawn fertilizers 3%, impervious surfaces 5%. And I believe what they're meaning by the impervious surfaces, and we really didn't get a good clear answer on September 30th, 2018 by Mass DEP when they were starting to talk about impervious surfaces in atmospheric deposition. But impervious surfaces, as best we know from their description, and what I would believe to be is like parking lots, or anything that's going to, roof, anything that's going to cause water to run off excessively rather than hold back in the environment and maybe attenuate, leach, and then possibly attenuate within the contributing property. Next, please. So these regulations that Mass DEP is proposing are very specific regulations to those areas of Massachusetts that we showed in the second slide that were green, and any other areas that they may identify in the future. So Mass DEP is the regulatory agency of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts charged with promulgating regulations. One of those regulations is Title V. Those regulations that I mentioned earlier are those regulations that pertain to the siting, design, installation, and operation of septic systems. They also have other environmental charges, like the Clean Water Act, solid waste, and so on. So they've put forth, following these estuary reports, changes to their environmental code, Title V, as well as a new set of regulations that may come into influence in certain communities, and we'll get into that in a minute. And those are entitled 314 CMR 2100. And that's what we're talking about today. These regulations are draft regulations. There are public hearings coming up on November 30th, December 1st, and I believe on the 5th or the 6th. Please check our website, and we've got paper on the exact specifics of that. If these regulations are promulgated by Mass DEP as worded in the drafts, it is going to do one of two things to those areas of the Slocum River watershed that we have here in town. Mass DEP is going to have to designate it as a natural resource area. They have all the criteria in place at this time for that designation process to begin. Once that happens, and again, we're getting out if these regulations promulgate as is. If that happens, then that's going to leave Dartmouth with one of two options. And again, the same is likely to occur with Westport, as I understand the status of the Westport River watershed. So you can see as we've got those regulations in that right box at the top, if they're promulgated, which drops down to the middle, that's going to put us to one of two options. The first option is that everyone within the watershed will have to upgrade their septic systems to include a best, I think the terminology is best available nitrogen-reducing technology. That'll be on a subsequent slide. I struggle with that, and you'll see why in a subsequent slide. Go back. Next. Next, next. Next, next. Slow it down. Next. No, you're going the wrong way. Nope. Back. Back. Yep. Up. Forward one. So, that is the first option. Everyone in the watershed in 5 years, upon the designation of a natural resource area, will have to include one of these technologies. That sounds pretty drastic. I find it hard to believe most communities with a large land area will take that approach. So the other option is what is called the watershed permit, where you attack your nitrogen loading into the river or your nitrogen levels in the river through a comprehensive watershed permit. That is something that has to be entered into by an agency of the town. It is a 20-year permit, and the permit itself, as it's described in the regulations, requires monitoring. It requires annual reporting by the town, and there's also other caveats in there. The watershed permit can only be renewed once. It's a 20-year permit, and it can only be renewed once. DEP may not even issue that permit if you cannot demonstrate that you can remove 75% of what is needed to restore ecological health and reduce the level. What's most concerning about the watershed permit process is that it's not a guarantee. So if we have to reduce the number, the concentration at a certain location to a certain amount and we don't, because of other influences, that is a problem for the permittee. Also, there is no guarantee that if we reduce all of the concentrations to or slightly below, that we'll even restore the benthic life, those organisms that we expect to see in an unimpaired watershed, and the plant life, the eelgrass. So the comprehensive permit through the watershed process, I don't expect that to be an easy decision as part of the overall local legislative process. I'm not here tonight to talk to you about how the Department of Health for the town of Dartmouth is going to weigh in on this. We will weigh in on these regulations in the near future, likely before December 1st, and we will post that to our website. But I want you to understand that Mass DEP, through these proposals, believes that just getting a signatory to these regulations, having a consultant perform this convoluted application process, which really is complicated, and then we can exact that strategy, is ignorant of the complexities of local government. These watersheds are not in a single community. They're shared by multiple communities. They're also, as you can see with those earlier charts, there's influences between Dartmouth and Westport that are vastly different. You can also maybe understand, if you follow town politics for a while, and in any town, that the legislative process is not singular, that you have autonomous boards, and you have boards that don't have full ability. So even if a Board of Health was to say, we're going to take up the charge to sign for this comprehensive watershed permit, that board cannot mandate the planning boards, the town meetings, the Board of Public Works, the conservation commissions, that they must promulgate and pass regulations so that we can perform. Those are separately divided aspects of local government that have their own vote and due process. And all that aside, we convene here twice a year, once here, once in the middle school, for our town meetings. And it's up to the voters on how they want to vote for zoning issues. And sometimes if we're trying to restrict property for protection of the environment, it may have to come through zoning, and then it gets into the convoluted nature of zoning and grandfathering. So I don't necessarily have a lot of comfort in this watershed permit process as being a recipe for success for our community or any other community. To me, it seems like we're setting up our successors to fail. We stand here today in a building that was planned in the early 2000s, but the land was purchased in the mid-70s for a new school. We have one of the few operating landfills in Dartmouth. That landfill was planned in the early 70s and really aggressively sought out in the late 70s with land acquisitions, while our Russell's Mills landfill still had another 20 years to go. So we shouldn't be so short-sighted to ignore all of these things because DEP may not be aware. Unfortunately, we were not a part to this subcommittee that put forth these proposals. So if this concerns you all, I strongly advise you to participate in the public process. Because even if a Board of Health, or maybe a select board or both, may want to go to the watershed permit process, we can't guarantee you that the legislative process will complete. There's too many working parts to it. We also don't know what the cost is going to be associated with that comprehensive watershed permit. That comprehensive watershed permit, in and of itself, is going to require an individual town meeting appropriation for the permit. And then a year-to-year maintenance fee for reporting and testing. Municipal governments are strained. I live in the town of Westport. And Westport now has another financial burden with the Diamond High School that wasn't approved by override. So these are all the things that we're facing down here on the local level that were not considered when Mass DEP put this forth through their subcommittee. At least it would have been nice, based on what I know for Westport, they didn't comment from Westport, and I don't have any comments that were solicited from us during the process. The real trouble with the comprehensive permit that you all have to know is that it's a passing of the buck. It is a passing of the buck to the locals. Because while it all sounds well and good for us to attack nitrogen more globally across the pie chart, the reality is, in my opinion, in this initial phase, I don't see how we're not going to have to go after wastewater in some capacity or another. We will not know that until we're well out into the application process and a consultant is running numbers, identifying how much needs to come out from where, and build out projections, and what our plan is, and is it enough? At least here in Dartmouth, as you can see from our initial comment, Dartmouth has been one of the most proactive communities, I believe, in the South Coast. You can see in those letters that myself and Mr. O'Reilly from the Conservation Commission wrote in 2018 about the successes of Dartmouth with some of the earliest stormwater requirements, aquifer requirements to limit impervious area, land acquisitions, as well as significant sewering that occurred. So I wish I could provide you more on that, but I can only provide you with the uncertainty of that. And last evening, I attended an informational seminar or info session by Mass DEP. And they provided a chart on the screen, and it said, who's going to bear the cost of these proposals? And in the first column, they showed the 5-year approach. And they said, well, the homeowner, obviously, is going to have to upgrade their septic system to these best available nitrogen-reducing technologies. So they're going to bear it. On the comprehensive permit, they said the town's going to bear it, and it'll be through higher tax rates. Well, I don't believe that's a complete representation of the reality of what these permits are going to do. Because, as I said earlier, once we get out into the calculations of a comprehensive permit, if all these other things that we want to try to go after to try to get these levels down, and we can't, we may be very well forced to looking at septics. And that cost will be borne by the residents. Now, the state will talk about the state revolving fund and betterments and, all that to help along the process. But that's not free money. That's debt. So if someone needs to borrow the money to install one of these septic systems, the money has to get paid back. So it's not free money. There's also some other concerns. I'll get to that in a minute. The last thing I want to get into with the 5-year approach is, once a watershed is designated as a natural resource area, that starts the clock ticking for either the 5-year approach or the comprehensive watershed. There's a disclosure requirement for anyone that is selling a property in section 215.4. If they are in a nitrogen-sensitive area, that they have to disclose that upon transfer. So I believe that is something that's extraordinarily important, because I was around with the town in 1995 when the whole Title V inspection process started, and I saw all the confusion and the mayhem that resulted from that. I certainly believe that, as these natural resource areas are identified because of them being an NSA, we will see that confusion until such time that a town decides whether or not they're going to apply for a permit. And I have questions whether or not those internal discussions and all the time it's going to take to lead up to get all the necessary approvals, if you're exempt. I don't necessarily think you are, because you don't have that permit. Next. So what is the best available nitrogen-reducing technology, as so often called out in this revision to 310 CMR 1500? I don't know. They kind of hint around at it, but there is no explicit standard in these regulations. It's an arbitrary assignment of performance. As someone who's been a regulator, and unfortunately with regulations sometimes we become an enforcer, you have to have standards to enforce. What's troubling about this best available technology is it becomes a moving finish line, maybe. We just don't know. Next. So, existing regulations provide for septic systems to be of innovative and alternative design. That already exists. We've had those regulations for a while. They can be found in sections 15.280 through 288. A few of these systems perhaps may be what DEP is alluding to, but their failure to adequately provide a specification for performance only leaves me with scratching my head as to what they will settle down at, or will this be a moving target? That is not unlike Mass DEP, who has a convoluted sound policy that sources from their inadequate regulation on noise, where it says noise is air pollution. And they have this convoluted policy that, unfortunately, a local health department attempted to enforce and lost, because the policy was more prescriptive and didn't go through due process. What are innovative alternative septic systems? Innovative alternative septic systems are systems that are almost like mini wastewater treatment plants. Many of you, I would bet almost, all of you except for maybe one or two perhaps, have conventional septic systems. Water rolls downhill. You may require a pump because of your groundwater elevation. The pump lifts the wastewater to your leaching field, and it drains through. What we know is that those sorts of septic systems, those conventional septic systems, are great at protecting the public health. However, removal of nitrogen is not easily accomplished. So it does require some sort of advanced treatment that, so far, what we're seeing is largely achieved through mechanics. So blowers, circulators, media, where the effluent runs over the media, essentially a mini wastewater treatment plant like we have down the street. Because of all the mechanics of this, Mass DEP requires these systems that are approved under 280 through 288 to have a licensed wastewater treatment plant operator oversee those year-to-year operations at those individual households. They also require that there is an active operation and maintenance contract as part of all of the approvals. That's on file with the Board of Health. And again, they're mechanical, so they require electricity, so there's an added cost with that. Next. So unfortunately, this is a little bit grainy. You'll be able to get pictures, but those of you that might have seen your septic systems get installed, you might have seen the big box, the concrete tank, the pipes, the stone leaching field, and that's it. So these are just some pictures of some of the alternative systems that have gone in Dartmouth. You can see that it's a lot different than what you may have seen or may have traditionally seen. We've got, in some cases, we've got actual pressure pipes rather than water flowing downhill. It's more like an irrigation system. But there's a fair number of IA systems that Massachusetts has approved. But again, we know that they may be looking at a certain standard, which may call out many of them, but they failed to specify that in these regulations. Next. So for anyone here that's concerned about this, maybe I'll be selling my home in the future, maybe there's a real estate agent here. So these are the proposed regulations as it applies to the transfer once that natural resource area designation exists. Prior to any transfer of title for property where the facility is located, the owner shall disclose to the buyer and the Board of Health whether the facility is subject to an upgrade requiring best available nitrogen-reducing technology pursuant to 215. Now, when I was showing you all those maps up there earlier, could you pick out your house? Could you pick out your street? Probably not. So you can see that this is going to create a lot of confusion, especially with that transition period. Once that NSA designation is made, how do we get the word out to the realtors? Is adequate disclosure and potential liability? Next. So as part of my research in all of this, I've been looking at a lot of state documents because, this is something that's going to impact all of us. This is not only going to impact you and those other people in these watersheds, this could potentially impact all of the towns. If we're going to be looking for a watershed permit, we're going to be looking for funding sources at town meeting and looking to take existing money from other sources. Because, Dartmouth is not a town that is, seeing a lot of new growth. So we're limited in our revenue stream coming in. So to take, whatever it's going to cost for these permits, which we don't know yet, it's going to impact everyone. But the reason why I brought this out is because this is an actual statement by Mass DEP within the last few years. And it was in response to the Westport River watershed TMDL approval. With current technology, it appears that the use of IA systems alone would not meet the required nitrogen reductions. So in essence, they're admitting that if we do option 1 with the 5-year mandate in that Westport River watershed, that's clear. I can't argue with that statement to say that they meant something else. So essentially, they're trying to force us into these comprehensive permits that we don't know if we'll succeed in even achieving the funding sources. So I wanted you to see that because it is really important for you all to know about all of the uncertainties that are involved in the comprehensive permit, DEP's uncertainties that even the 5-year approach may not restore what they intend to restore. Next. So you may have some questions. I didn't want to sit here talking for an extensive amount of time. I want to turn it over to you if you have anything that's specific. I'm not here to be a spokesperson for Mass DEP. I am just here to be a public servant to talk to you all about any questions that you may have about what I think these regulations may do here in Dartmouth. So you can check the website. It is up there. We tried to hand out papers with QR codes. Give our office a call. We want you all to be informed. And we'll be updating periodically, so please check back often. We want you to be well aware of all of the information that we're getting in regards to the protection of the Slocum River and the Westport River watersheds. Any critiques that have been offered here today are not against restoring the viability of these ecosystems. It's about the impacts of what they've proposed. And unfortunately, one of the largest communities, or the largest community in Buzzards Bay, was omitted from the nitrogen subcommittee process of developing these regulations. And again, in the second largest community, be it Westport, I don't believe had any participation on the municipal level. So with that being said, if anyone has any questions, happy to answer as best I can. Sure.
Is there anywhere else in the United States where these mitigation measures are being proposed with such a high cost associated with them? Then I have a second part of it.
Use the microphone.
I can repeat that, sir. So his first question was, are there any other areas in the United States that are facing such similar mandate? Is that correct, sir?
Yes.
Okay. I am aware of some efforts on Long Island. Unfortunately, I'm busy serving you all in Dartmouth and getting in early and staying late. But I am aware of efforts on Long Island as well as some unique financial incentives that were offered in certain counties in Long Island. Any other? Did you have a second part?
Yes, I do. The agricultural runoff was certainly a large number in Westport. We do definitely have a lot of agricultural properties that are along our rivers and some of the tributaries to these rivers. In addition, lawn fertilizers. I mean, I respect the science that probably goes into breaking down those percentages, but put the burden on all homeowners just really seems unfair, especially in the times we're in. And there are also impacts that go beyond that. The $10,000 to $15,000 cost that was cited for some rough estimates. You could have lawn irrigation that's in the way of that could be impacted. Grading of front lawns, aesthetics, tons of things that could happen when you start to play around with septic systems. So it's kind of disheartening to hear that the communities in Dartmouth and Westport didn't have a seat at the table, and these committees kind of operated in a vacuum. So who can be contacted at that level, and is their final say like a decree? Is it a consent decree situation?
So this is right now what we are in is the active phase of promulgation. Due process requires certain advanced notice of the intention to change regulations. It requires public hearings to be held where the public can attend and comment. And it also allows for a written period, a comment period where you can submit written comments. And what I would also add is that, if you have concerns, that, check back on our website, because those comments, when they're made in writing about these regulations as part of the comment period, usually have to go to a very specific person at whatever the regulatory agency is. So we'll have that posted to our website. I believe, we got to do some research on if that email's been posted yet, but I would suspect that we'll have it up no later than the first public hearing. But in the meantime, we all serve someone. Mass DEP, they're supposed to serve the Commonwealth, and there are elected officials that you all can contact if you are unhappy about any or pleased with the process. And those elected officials being Mass DEP as a state organization. Thank you. The only thing I do want to kind of, you did talk about runoff and everything else. The problem with the comprehensive permit is that the town does not have absolute authority to control all sources of nitrogen in a watershed that are controllable. And those sources that are controllable are divided up: boards of health through septic systems, runoff, boards of public works, planning boards, impervious area, zoning. It's a juggle, and they all have their own process. And then sometimes those processes even are duplicate and have to land right back at the annual town meeting and receive a 2/3 vote. And then they're still subject to grandfathering. And then the uncertainty of the comprehensive permit as it applies to 40Bs. What a 40B is an affordable housing project. We're hearing about a lot of emphasis right now on affordability of housing. So if a 40B project is proposed in an area that is covered by a comprehensive permit, those are local approaches. So my initial read on it is that I don't think that's going to be applying to that 40B, that those comprehensive permit provisions go out the window. 40Bs are protected by statute, and that would require a separate legislative process to incorporate the comprehensive permit through the watershed regulations, 314-2100, into. Because one thing about these 40B developers, they're very well aware of their exemptions, and they will push back, and it goes up to the state, and then the state opines on it, and there's not much we can do. But just to get back to some of the uncertainty, agriculture in most states, as well as Massachusetts, is very closely protected. So there isn't a whole lot that can be done in terms of regulating agricultural runoff. So if you look at some of these reports, they'll talk about BMPs, best management practices. So I'm not sure that there's a whole lot. There's also been some agricultural trends that have varied from the time in which this report was created, or reports were created, to agricultural practices that we're seeing now. Both, I believe, in the benefit of agriculture, but also other practices that might be on the periphery of agriculture that might be contributing pollution that we don't have control over. And if you're interested more in that, check our website in about 2 weeks.
Thank you for the response. I appreciate that.
Thank you, sir.
Did you get a pink form?
I've seen the website, so I did take a photo of that. I would just close with this. It really you've articulated the response pretty well in terms of talking about these protected entities, the Chapter 40Bs and the agriculture. It really just seems that they're squarely putting the burden on the residential homeowner because they're vulnerable and subject to these kind of just wacky regulations, because it's draconian to think that
private conversation. The rest of us cannot hear you. So use the microphones. There's one there and there's one over there. Use the microphone.
I'm done with what I got to say. Thanks a lot. Got a problem with that. That's too bad.
So he was, he was just mentioning that, he supports ecological restoration, but, there are concerns with the financing, the financial burden of this.
I'm all set. I finished my comment.
Sir.
Thank you for having this meeting. I appreciate it. My name's Robert Almy. I live on Smith Neck Road. I've only been in town for 3 years, so forgive me, I'm a newcomer. But my background is I'm a professional geologist. I run a regional water agency, develop stormwater programs, and watershed plans. My last job had me out on, excuse me, on Cape Cod, and working, among other things, on nitrate mitigation and septic system issues. I want to add some stuff to what Chris said. First, if you look back at the first map that he showed, the reason that DEP is doing this is they've got a serious water quality problem out on the Cape, and they're imposing a one-size-fits-all approach that doesn't work well here. Among other things, the geology here is very different. I have problems. I've looked over the various reports. I'm supposed to be retired, and this starts to feel like a full-time job now. So in terms of the science, the habitat delineations are over 20 years old. We don't know what we're trying to protect. The data for water quality is over 16 years old. We don't know what the water quality is right now, given all the steps that the town has taken in the last 20 years to improve water quality, including stormwater quality and sewering. The science that was done has not made any effort to correlate rainfall and flow with nitrogen, and I would argue that nitrogen's not the issue. The issue is nitrates and ammonia, and trying to regulate on something as simple as nitrogen just doesn't reach the types of species that cause environmental effects. Chris alluded to unrealistic objectives. There's more than a numerical standard here. Although the numerical standard that the state says is 0.36 at a lower Slocum River measurement point, the last time that was measured, 16 years ago, the number was 0.39. So we're pretty close, but as Chris alluded to, the state has other objectives that are, in a word, squishy. They want to see a habitat restoration in a situation where there is no, at least to my knowledge, not a lot of experience in restoring these kinds of habitats. There's no accounting for climate change in these regulations. We don't know what changes in temperature and precipitation may or may not do to whatever plans are developed for restoration. And there's the issue of sedimentation at the mouth of the Slocum River and changes in flow. That hasn't been accounted for. And finally, there have been a number of land use changes, and I take exception to the fact that in the TMDL, septic systems account for 14% of the nitrogen in the lower Slocum River. These kinds of retrofitted systems may achieve something like 50, 60, 70% removal of nitrogen, maybe, which means you're only getting a percentage of that 14%. and expecting that to do the job. And I'll say this because I've seen the numbers. These retrofits are really expensive. They can run $8,000 to $14,000 if you have a relatively new septic system. If you got an old one, it could easily be double that. Now, I'd like to have anybody here that's either rebuilt or put in a septic system in the last, say, 3 or 4 years. Anybody done that here? All right, I don't see any hands. You can imagine, as a homeowner or purchasing a new, an existing home here, you just bought a house. You just had the system upgraded, or you built it, expanded your house, and you spent a lot of money putting in a new septic system, and here comes the state, and they say, okay, you got 5 years, and you got to spend another bunch of money changing because it wasn't good enough when you did it, okay? This is not a good situation. These regulations need to be worked on. My opinion is the state needs to come back. It needs to spend time with this town and the town of Westport. They need to do more science, and they need to do this, and if it's that important, it's worth doing right. Thank you.
Excellent,
Hi, Dave Tattlebaum, Pearl Street in South Dartmouth, and I am on the select board, but I speak for myself, not for my members, but I'll try to encourage them. First off, you all remember how we started off with COVID many years back, and it was through Mr. Michaud's leadership that we mobilized the entire town. Every department head, our town administrator, and the town of Dartmouth survived and prospered because of the work of Chris's leadership. The state has told us, nobody's arguing that we have a problem with the water. What they have told us is they don't have a solution, but they want to force us to do a solution that they don't even believe in themselves. My view is that we have, just like Mr. Michaud, we have very qualified individuals in our departments, at DPW, at conservation, in planning, right throughout the town, who are full-time employees who have the quality. We mobilize all these people. We call on our legislative bodies, Mr. Montigny, Mr. Markey, and we go to the state and tell them we're going to review it, and we maybe even have to get us a consultant to tell us what the best solution is. Because, Mr. Almy, who is Robert's the chair of the DPW, that's the kind of quality we have in town, and the interest to try to protect our town. But I think the state's telling us, if you don't do anything, we're going to just jam it down your throat. And we're saying, we're going to mobilize and do the right thing, whatever that might be. And it's up to us to make sure we respond properly so that we don't get penalized, but also do it in a way that we somehow find a way to get the solution, whatever that might be. And I'm not a scientist, so I'm not the one, but I think I know how to get people in the same room together who are qualified to try to get that right decision, whatever that is. But they can't jam us down our throat because they don't have the answers either, which isn't very fair, but that's the way they do it. So I want to just congratulate Mr. Michaud. Great presentation tonight.
Al Tavares. I live in 7 Warbler Way in North Dartmouth, Mass. I'm not a scientist either. I'm an IT guy by trade, so I don't know all the answers here either, but I really appreciate all the really good information, both Chris and this gentleman over here, I forget your name, the retired gentleman there who seems to know everything about watersheds, so I really appreciate that. I'm just a little concerned too about how they're just approaching this, and looking at those graphs, 30% was attributed to septic systems. What about the other 66%? Like, what are they going after there? For example, we know that there's a farm just south of our Songbird Acres neighborhood who are not, it's not only an odor concern because they have a composting facility on their farm. And my question is, like, have they done any studies about composting, which is becoming more and more prevalent in our, in these areas where a lot of these farms and a lot of these places are being pushed by the DEP to start composting, and they're making good money off of that. But I don't know how regulated these composting facilities are and how much can be attributed to them as well.
That's a great question, sir. Let me just adjust. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. That is a great question about what is DEP doing to assess the impacts of composting, which is proliferating throughout Massachusetts since they comprehensively deregulated the solid waste regulations, I think it was around 2013 or 2014, to promote the diversion of organics away from landfills and to compost sites. But they only did it for large generators. So you had to produce 2,000 pounds a week. And if you did, then that necessitated it going off to one of the deregulated solid waste handling facilities. So it was either going to be a compost site, what's called also an anaerobic digester, which the only one in the area is at Stop and Shop in Freetown. It's like a big giant vessel in which they put all the feedstock in, the organics, and it generates a gas that you can generate electricity from. That also produces a waste, which then you've got to deal with that as well. And I know that one community has kind of battled that as well. So I have done, most recently, I've done some records requests on MDAR, which is the Mass Department of Agricultural Resources, as well as Mass DEP. Those are the two state agencies that have been charged by statute with overseeing composting in Massachusetts. At this point in time, I've received limited information. I've also been withheld on information, and yesterday I filed with the Secretary of State an appeal because of the non-compliance by Mass DEP with the state's law to provide records. So I don't know yet. I hope to have more information to you, hopefully before the conclusion of this public process for participation in these proposed regulations. Because while DEP will try to sidestep that and say this has nothing, that has nothing to do with this, I say absolutely not. Because 314-2100 absolutely does. Because they're telling us that IA systems in that highlighted paragraph in the prior slide won't do it. We're going to have to look elsewhere. And when all these studies were performed in the Westport River watershed in 2003 through 2009 and 2001 through 2006 at the Slocum, we didn't have deregulated composting here in Massachusetts. What I'm also prepared to tell you is that on September 30th, about 2018, we made these concerns to Mass DEP. I also provided them with an extensive comment letter that you can find on our website. Their response to that letter with exhibits, with pictures of compost sites was, oh, that looks like a violation. But they did nothing. They did nothing. We went out there and we tested. We gave them that testing data. So at this point in time, the town of Dartmouth is the only entity that I'm aware of that's tested leachate at a composting facility. And the results are riveting. 3,900 milligrams per liter thereabout in the leachate pools alongside the piles. What we're looking at for a septic system kind of ranges a bit. I've seen numbers from 25 to 40 on various reports, but industry experts that I trust have said, septic systems may put out 80 milligrams per liter at most. 3,900 milligrams per liter. Looks like a violation, and they did nothing. The town of Dartmouth pursued that violation, fortunately through the assistance of town council, and we had to take action, and we got it shut down. But DEP never stepped forth. I also want to note that when that composting operation was permitted as one of our first composting operations, I wrote an extensive letter objecting to the issuance of that general permit, which any of you all can get because it's just you fill it out You mail it in, you give us a copy, and they issue it. Doesn't even require a fee. I issued an extensive letter objecting, and everything I objected to came true. So, you know, your point is well taken, Mr. Tavas. Unfortunately, I'm just that mosquito in the ear of Mass DEP. They don't want to listen to me because nothing happens to them. And as we're now seeing on your issue, Westminster has got some concerns and a Mass DEP investigation. We also saw a number of fires across Massachusetts this year at composting sites. We've had a fire here in Dartmouth, endangering our first responders. So, you know, your point is well taken. I just hope one day it can get to the right person and we can get comprehensive change on that too. Because in that 2018 letter where I responded to the TMDL process with DEP, I itemized the volume of organics coming into Dartmouth to compost sites. And if my memory is right, it was somewhere to the tune of about 40% of the regional refuse district's tonnage. 40%. Anyone else?
I'm Chris Barkey. I'm the state rep, and I'm the guy you're going to be yelling at. So I think first, Dave mentioned it briefly about Chris during COVID, but I think when you talk about composting and you talk about this issue, Chris has been on the top of it right from the get-go, and we've been talking about it for a couple of months now and the concerns. I think what we need to look at is exactly what Chris is talking about and his expertise in this. One of the things that I would love to be able to get is the numbers on, let's look at how in our town it is really the development of homes that have occurred in the last 30 or 40 years. And they're expanding out closer to the farmlands. And I would love to know what 30 or 40 years ago, what the nitrogen was like in the watershed areas and compare it to what it is now. And if you see only a slight increase with the homes, you can easily say that has really nothing to do with it. It's coming from the areas in which you have expressed concerns with. And we have expressed concerns with DEP and MDR with the composting. So I think one of the things I would say is we will be dealing with DEP in a very direct way at the state level and bring to their attention these things throughout this process. And that the idea of the CAPE process, which is totally different than what our land is like, is really what we need to do. It is easy for them to regulate when everything is exactly the same. And what we need to be able to express, and I think everyone in the town needs to be able to do, is make sure that that loud voice and a unified voice of the concerns are expressed to DEP. Because that's what's going to make a difference, is having a whole bunch of people saying things and not just one or two people. And I can guarantee that I will be strongly advocating to make sure that these regulations, although well-purposed, may not be the answer to their problem. And when you look at the numbers that Chris has presented, you have to say in a very logical way, their process will have a minuscule effect on what their real goal is. So we need to discuss that with them. I will be talking about it. I'll be advocating, and I know Senator Montigny will be too. So just wanted to let you know that. The other thing, I joked at the beginning about a place to yell at. My email is on the website at the Mass State Legislature. Feel free to email me with concerns or questions. Happy to answer them and get back to you. Okay, take care.
Anyone else? So if you know anyone that wasn't able to attend, you know, we do have DC TV here this evening. They are videoing this. You know, we'll make sure that the link is also posted on the Board of Health website. You'll also be able to probably search it on Channel 18. They got a nice little search, and you'll be able to find it, or it'll probably be up in one of the more recent feeds once they upload it. So if you have trouble finding it, you know, call myself, you know, call the Board of Health, and I'm sure even DC TV could probably help you out on that. Sorry, DC TV, but you know, you may have questions after this. I know I kind of skimmed over an awful lot. There's a lot to this, but there's not a lot, as I hopefully presented to you. So, you know, we're around. Reach out to me. Email, phone call. You know, want to make sure that, you know, any questions that you may have, we answer. And, you know, thank you, Mr. Tattlebaum. Thank you, Representative Markey. You know, for your praises, but, you know, it was a team effort with all of that on everything, whether it was the composting enforcement or COVID. You know, we got a great team at the Board of Health, Emergency Management Director, and so on. But that's not what that meeting's about tonight. So, any other questions? Thank you. And if you have any questions for me, you know, as you're leaving, certainly seek me out. You know, I live on this road. Is that in the watershed?